A cry for help across the stars. In the year 2356, humanity had become a force to be reckoned with, its reach extending far beyond Earth and across the stars. Known throughout the galaxy as bold, resilient, and fiercely independent, humanity was a beacon of hope to many and a source of fear to others. The United Earth Federation, UEF, had built a powerful fleet of warships and established colonies on countless planets, each world a testament to human ingenuity. But despite their might, there was a corner of the galaxy where humanity's strength had yet to be tested, a corner where an entire species was on the brink of extinction. The Larians, a peaceful alien race known for their advanced knowledge of bioengineering and deep respect for all life, had long flourished on their lush homeworld of Laris. But now, their once beautiful planet was under siege. The Zarks, a ruthless and war-hungry species with far superior military technology, had launched a full-scale invasion. With no military power of their own, the Larians were helpless, watching as their cities were burned and their people slaughtered. In the Grand Council chamber of Laris, High Chancellor Alara sat, staring out at the stars. The once thriving planet was now a battlefield, and the Larians had nowhere left to turn. Her hands trembled as she activated an ancient communication device, a relic of a time when her people believed in unity among the stars. Her voice, filled with sorrow and desperation, echoed through the void as she sent out a call for help. To anyone who hears this, Alara's voice crackled over the device. We are the Larians, a peaceful people of Laris. Our world is being torn apart by the Zarks. We have no military, no means to defend ourselves. We need your help, please. As her message traveled across the stars, it reached the ears of Captain Nathaniel Cross, commander of the UEF warship Pride of Humanity. He had just completed a routine patrol when the distress signal arrived, cutting through the cold silence of space. The urgency in Alara's plea sent a chill down his spine. The Zarks were a threat he knew all too well, their conquests across the galaxy leaving a trail of destruction in their wake. Captain Cross had spent years defending humanity, but this was different. The Larians were not a militaristic race, but a peaceful one, easy targets for the brutal Zarks. He knew that if humanity didn't intervene, the Larians would fall. And yet, Cross understood the gravity of the decision. To risk the lives of his crew and his ship was no small matter. The UEF was strong, but they were spread thin, stretched across countless conflicts. He called a meeting with his senior officers. Commander Olivia Drake, a sharp-witted tactician, Lieutenant Rafe Rice, the ship's chief engineer, Dr. Jenna Toth, a compassionate medical officer, and Ensign Lina Fields, a skilled pilot with a keen sense of danger. They gathered in the briefing room, each one aware of the risks involved. Cross played the message from the Larians. As Alara's voice filled the room, a heavy silence fell over the group. Each officer felt the weight of the decision. We can't ignore this, Captain Cross said, his voice low but firm. The Zarks will wipe them out if we do nothing. We have the power to stop it. We'll go in, strike fast, and evacuate as many Larians as we can before the Zarks can retaliate. Dr. Toth, the ship's medical officer, spoke up first. Captain, we don't know how many Larians are left. There's no telling what the Zarks have already done. If we're going in, we'll need to be prepared for anything. Commander Drake nodded. The Zarks are formidable, but we've faced worse odds before. We can't let fear stop us from doing what's right. Agreed. Lieutenant Reyes added. The Pride of Humanity is built for this. We have the technology, the crew, and the resolve to face the Zarks head-on. Captain Cross studied each of his officers. He knew the risks, but he also knew what was at stake. We'll make a stand for the Larians. They need us, and we won't abandon them. With the decision made, the crew of the Pride of Humanity set course for Laris, unaware of the challenges and dangers that awaited them. The Zarks would not give up their conquest easily, and Alarian's survival now rested in the hands of humanity. A galactic plea for help. As the distress signal echoed through space, its faint whispers carrying the weight of an entire civilization's desperation, Captain Jonathan Reynolds paced back and forth in his ready room aboard the HFY Resolute. The massive UEF warship hummed with activity, but for Jonathan, the peaceful routine of the crew's duties felt like an unsettling contrast to the chaos unfolding light years away. His mind raced through the possibilities of what he could do. The Larians, a race known for their peaceful nature and advanced bioengineering, were helpless against the merciless Zarks. Jonathan had fought battles before, but this was different. He wasn't being asked to defend a colony or a territory. He was being called to protect a race from utter annihilation. The emotional weight of it gnawed at him, but he was no stranger to difficult choices. The fact that none of the other species had responded to the Larian's plea made him feel even more resolute in his decision. Humanity had long been misunderstood in the galaxy, feared, respected, and yet often left to fend for itself. But this time, humanity's compassion would be its strength. With a deep breath, Jonathan activated the intercom, calling his senior officers to the briefing room. It was time to make a decision. The briefing room was stark and functional, a space where decisions were made with the cold precision that was required in their line of work. As each officer filed in, Jonathan gave them a nod, his gaze heavy with the weight of the task at hand. Commander Sarah Vega took her seat beside him, her expression a mix of concern and determination. Lieutenant Aisha Patel, the brilliant engineer whose innovations had saved them countless times in the past, was already scribbling notes on her datapad. Dr. Emily Carter, the ship's compassionate medical officer, sat quietly, her eyes meeting Jonathan's with an understanding that went beyond words. Lieutenant James Hunter, the tactical genius and ace pilot, leaned against the wall with a quiet confidence. The room fell silent as Jonathan pressed a button on the console, and the message from High Chancellor Aura played once more. The desperation in her voice was unmistakable, her plea for help clear and simple. "The Larians cannot defend themselves," Jonathan said after a moment. "The Zarks are coming, and if we don't intervene, they'll be wiped out. We've faced worse odds before, and we've always come out on top. But this is different. This isn't just about winning a battle. It's about ensuring that a peaceful race doesn't perish." He paused, allowing his words to sink in. His officers exchanged glances, each processing the gravity of the situation. Finally, Commander Vega spoke up. "Captain, I understand the stakes," she said, her voice steady but tinged with concern. "But the Zarks are ruthless. They have the firepower to wipe out entire fleets. Engaging them directly could lead to significant losses for us. We don't even know the full extent of their numbers or their strategies. What if we're walking into a trap?" Jonathan's gaze never wavered. He had considered the risks carefully, but he couldn't afford to hesitate. "We can't turn our backs on them, Sarah. The Larians are too defenseless. If we don't act, who will? The galaxy has turned its back on them, and I won't stand by while a peaceful race is exterminated." There was a heavy pause, and then Dr. Carter spoke up, her voice gentle yet firm. "Captain, I've seen the damage the Zarks can do firsthand. They don't just destroy. They erase everything in their path. The Larians may have no military, but they have something far more valuable: knowledge, science, and a way of life that could help us all." Lieutenant Hunter, who had been quietly observing the conversation, finally broke the silence. "You're right, Captain," he said, his voice calm but resolute. "We've faced the impossible before. I trust that we'll find a way to make it work. We need to act fast, though. The longer we wait, the worse the odds become." Jonathan nodded. "I knew you'd understand, James. We'll do this together. We'll show the Zarks what happens when they mess with humanity." The room grew quiet again as the weight of the decision settled over them. There were no more words to say, only action. The Resolute would be the last line of defense for the Larians. They would face the Zarks, no matter the cost. As the meeting concluded, Jonathan stepped out onto the bridge, the crew already hard at work preparing for the mission ahead. The Resolute was a formidable vessel, but it was nothing compared to the sheer power of the Zarks. Yet Jonathan had a secret weapon: human ingenuity. The crew of the Resolute wasn't just skilled. They were pioneers, innovators who could adapt and find solutions where others saw only problems. They would not back down. "Set course for Loris," Jonathan ordered, his voice steady. "Maximum speed. We don't have much time." The ship's engines roared to life as the crew sprang into action. Jonathan felt a surge of adrenaline course through him. This was more than just a mission. This was a chance to prove that humanity wasn't just a force to be feared, it was a force for good. As the Resolute leaped into warp, heading toward the war-torn world of the Larians, Jonathan allowed himself a moment of reflection. They were embarking on a mission that would define the future of humanity's place in the galaxy. They would either stand tall or fall. But Jonathan knew one thing for certain: humanity would never forsake those in need. The stakes had never been higher, and the journey was only just beginning. The Larians' hope now rested on the shoulders of the human crew aboard the Resolute. Time was ticking, and the threat of the Zarks loomed ever closer. Jonathan and his team would need to act quickly, decisively, and with unwavering resolve if they were to have any chance of saving the peaceful race from annihilation. As the ship hurtled toward Loris, the crew prepared for what could be their most dangerous mission yet. But in the heart of every human aboard the Resolute, there burned a flame of hope. They would fight, not for glory or conquest, but for something far more important: the survival of a peaceful world. Would humanity's strength, ingenuity, and compassion be enough to overcome the threat of the Zarks? Only time would tell, but Jonathan Reynolds was determined to find out. The fate of the Larians and the future of interstellar cooperation depended on their success. Into the firestorm. The HSS Resolute tore through the vast expanse of space at maximum warp, its sleek, powerful engines propelling it toward Loris at an unprecedented speed. Captain Jonathan Reynolds stood at the helm of the ship, his fingers barely grazing the control panel. Every ounce of his focus was locked on the mission ahead, protecting the Larians from the destructive forces of the Zarks. The stakes couldn't have been higher, and he knew the gravity of what they were about to face. Behind him, the officers continued their work in a tense silence. The ever-busy hum of the Resolute was usually a comforting sound, but today it felt like a reminder of the weight that rested on their shoulders. Every member of the crew knew what was at risk. "Captain," Commander Sarah Vega's voice cut through the silence. Her tone was sharp, as always, but underneath it, Jonathan could hear the same worry he was feeling. "We've made contact with the Larians' communication relay, but there's a problem. The Zarks are already on their way, and they've managed to disrupt most of their defense systems." Jonathan clenched his jaw. The Larians were peaceful. Their technology was built around healing, bioengineering, and knowledge sharing, but they had never developed anything to fight off invaders. And now they were defenseless in the face of a force as brutal as the Zarks. "We'll get them through this, Sarah," Jonathan said, trying to sound confident. "Tell our engineers to prepare every defensive measure we have. We might be outgunned, but we have the advantage of surprise." "Aye, Captain," she replied, her fingers flying across her datapad as she relayed the orders. Jonathan turned back to the viewport, his gaze fixed on the distant, shimmering blue planet below. Loris, a beautiful, lush world that had once been a symbol of peace and unity, but now it was on the edge of destruction. He could almost feel the tension in the air, the pressure of time pushing them closer to an impending conflict. As the Resolute closed in on Loris, Lieutenant Aisha Patel, the ship's chief engineer, approached with a report. Her face was a picture of determination, but there was a hint of concern in her eyes. "Captain, I've gone over the ship's systems again. We have full power to the shields and weapons, but I'll be honest with you. The Zarks are a whole different breed. Their technology is superior to anything we've seen before. We can hold them off for a time, but we'll need to come up with something more if we're to win this fight." Jonathan turned toward her, locking eyes with the brilliant engineer. "I don't need to be told that, Aisha. But what I do need is a plan. How do we gain the upper hand?" Aisha hesitated for a moment before answering, her mind clearly racing. The Zarks are incredibly fast, but they rely on a signature-based tracking system. We might be able to create an electromagnetic pulse to temporarily disable their sensors, giving us a chance to strike. EMP, Jonathan mused, his mind working quickly. Can we make it large enough to cover their entire fleet? "We can certainly try," Aisha said, her voice eely. "But we'd need to get within range to deploy it, and that means getting past their front line." Jonathan nodded. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was their best chance. If they didn't act soon, the Zarks would be at Luris before they could make their move. "Do it. We'll get close enough to fire the EMP, and then we'll hit them with everything we've got." "Aye, Captain," Aisha said, her fingers already typing in the data. The Resolute dropped out of warp space just outside the Luris system, the planet's blue oceans and vast continents sprawling beneath them. It was an idyllic world, a stark contrast to the violence that would soon be unleashed. Jonathan took one last look at the planet. A moment of reflection fueled his resolve. "We're about to enter hostile territory," Commander Vega warned, her voice steady but tinged with urgency. "The Zarks are only a few light minutes away. Their fleet is already gathering." Jonathan's heart pounded as he turned back to the view of the planet. The next few minutes would determine the fate of an entire civilization. "Set course for the edge of their formation," he ordered. "We need to take them by surprise." The crew worked seamlessly, moving with practiced precision as they adjusted their course. But as they approached, an ominous signal flashed on the radar. Zark ships detected multiple signatures. It was happening faster than they had anticipated. "Captain," Lieutenant Hunter spoke up, his voice calm yet urgent. "We're going to have to move fast. They're already locking onto us." Jonathan's mind raced. If the Zarks saw them coming, they would have no chance. The only option was to catch them off guard, just as Aisha had suggested. But even as he prepared to give the order, something unexpected happened. A blip appeared on the scanner. A small ship, barely a fraction of the size of the Zark's fleet, appeared out of nowhere. "Who the hell is that?" Jonathan asked, squinting at the radar. "It's a human vessel, Captain," Sarah replied, her voice filled with surprise. "The signature matches a civilian ship, but it's moving in the exact direction we're heading. It looks like it's coming toward us." Jonathan's mind snapped into high gear. Who could be flying a civilian ship in the middle of a war zone? Was it a mistake, or was it someone trying to help? "Open a communication channel," he commanded. The ship's comms officer quickly established a link. The image that appeared on the screen was one Jonathan did not expect. The face of a man in his mid-40s appeared, his face lined with exhaustion, but filled with determination. He was dressed in civilian clothes, but the backdrop behind him suggested that he wasn't alone. "Captain Reynolds," the man said, his voice calm yet full of purpose. "I'm Alex Caldwell, and I'm not here by accident. I've got a few tricks up my sleeve. You'll need every edge you can get." Jonathan was stunned. He had never heard of Alex Caldwell before, but the way he spoke suggested he was no ordinary civilian. "What are you doing here, Caldwell?" Jonathan asked, his voice tinged with suspicion, but also curiosity. "I'm here to help," Caldwell replied, his eyes narrowing. "I've been tracking the Zarks for years, and I know their tactics. If you want to have a shot at this fight, you need my knowledge. But we don't have time to talk. We need to strike first, or you'll all be dead before you get a chance." Jonathan's mind raced. This man, a civilian, had knowledge about the Zarks that could change everything. He didn't trust easily, but they didn't have time to question him. The decision was made in an instant. "Get him on board, now," Jonathan ordered. "I'll hear him out once we've taken action." As Caldwell's ship docked with the Resolute, Jonathan's crew braced for the most dangerous fight of their lives. Caldwell, despite his unorthodox arrival, would become an invaluable asset. The plan was set in motion. EMP deployed, followed by a full-throttle assault on the Zark's fleet. But as the Resolute maneuvered into position, something unexpected happened. The Zark's fleet, which had been preparing for an attack, suddenly shifted its formations. They weren't reacting the way Jonathan had anticipated. It felt like they were waiting for something, perhaps anticipating the Resolute's every move. And that's when Jonathan realized. The battle for Laris wouldn't just be a war of weapons, it would be a war of minds. The calm before the storm. The Resolute hung in space like a silent predator, its sleek frame reflecting the distant light of Laris' twin moons. Every crew member aboard knew what was coming. With the Zark's fleet closing in, time was no longer a luxury. The fate of an entire world was at stake, and the pressure weighed heavily on Captain Jonathan Reynolds' shoulders. He could feel the tension in the air as he stood before the ship's command center, his eyes scanning the array of consoles and displays. But today, something was different. The arrival of Alex Caldwell had thrown everything into disarray. No one had expected this mysterious civilian to waltz onto their ship claiming to have knowledge about the Zarks. While Jonathan didn't fully trust Caldwell, he couldn't afford to dismiss him. Caldwell's insights into the Zarks' tactics were too valuable to ignore, and they were running out of options. "Captain," Commander Vega's voice broke through his thoughts. She stood at his side, her face set in an expression of grim determination. "Caldwell's aboard. He wants to speak with you." Jonathan nodded, pushing aside the nagging doubts in his mind. He couldn't let personal reservations cloud his judgment. The mission came first. The briefing room was small, but it felt like a war room. The atmosphere was thick with tension as Caldwell, now seated at the table, leaned forward with a determined look in his eyes. He was a civilian, yes, but there was something about him that screamed experience, something hardened by years of survival. "Captain Reynolds," Caldwell began, his voice low but intense, "I know you don't fully trust me, but we don't have time for second-guessing. The Zarks are a different kind of enemy. They don't think like us. They don't fight like us." Jonathan leaned forward, locking eyes with Caldwell. "Then explain it to me. What exactly are we dealing with?" Caldwell took a breath, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the tabletop. "The Zarks are a warrior race, but not in the way you might think. They're tactical geniuses, trained to exploit weaknesses and break their enemies down psychologically. They don't just destroy, they dismantle, piece by piece, until there's nothing left but chaos." "Chaos," Sarah Vega interjected. "That sounds like something we've tried before. We've seen them do that on several worlds." Caldwell nodded, acknowledging her point. "Exactly. But what you're not factoring in is their long-term strategy. They don't just attack the way most fleets would. They strike where it hurts the most. Mentally. They've done their homework, Captain. They know you. They know your crew. They know everything about your ship's strengths and weaknesses." Jonathan felt a cold chill crawl up his spine. It was unsettling. How could they know so much? He didn't have the answers, but Caldwell seemed to. "I don't believe you," Jonathan said bluntly, but his voice lacked conviction. "If they know all that, then why haven't they already wiped us out?" "Because they want you to make the first move," Caldwell answered with a knowing glance. "They want you to make the first mistake. It's not just a fight for control of Laris, it's a battle for your mind. They'll push you to your limits, force you to make decisions that will lead to your downfall." Sarah's brow furrowed. "So, what do you suggest we do? Just sit here and wait?" Caldwell leaned back in his chair, his eyes narrowing as he considered the question. "Not wait, but we need to shift our focus. The Zarks will engage us soon, but they're not just here to conquer. They're here to destroy your will. The moment they sense weakness, they'll exploit it. We need to play their game, but on our terms." Jonathan let the words hang in the air for a moment. "You're saying we should deceive them?" Caldwell nodded. "Deception, distraction, psychological warfare. If they think you're reacting the way they want, It will throw them off balance. They're used to seeing their enemies crumble under pressure. We need to do the opposite. We need to show them that we're unpredictable, that we're not easily manipulated. It was a bold plan, but the more Jonathan thought about it, the more it seemed like their only option. The Zarks thrived on fear and control. If they could take that away from them, they might stand a chance. But Jonathan knew it wasn't going to be easy. Every move had to be calculated, precise. We'll need more than just tricks to win this fight, Jonathan said, his mind working through the possibilities. Our defenses are holding up for now, but once they're upon us, they'll hit hard. Caldwell interrupted, but they won't expect you to fight back the way they think you will. You've got the firepower, but you need to use it differently. It's not enough to just defend. You have to force them to react to you. The next few hours were a blur of planning and preparation. Jonathan and his officers worked tirelessly, incorporating Caldwell's suggestions into their battle strategy. The Resolute had its share of powerful weapons, plasma torpedoes, railguns, and a powerful energy shield. But those weren't the weapons that would win this war. It was going to be their ability to outthink the Zarks, to play their mind games, and to make every move count. But the clock was ticking. As the Zarks' fleet neared, Jonathan knew they didn't have much time left to prepare. The Resolute was nearly in range. The opening move had to be perfect. "Captain," Lieutenant Aisha Patel called out, her voice filled with urgency. "The Zarks' fleet has changed course. They're positioning themselves directly between us and Loris. They're preparing for a full assault." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. The battle was starting. "Brace for impact," he ordered, his voice unwavering. "Prepare for evasive maneuvers." The crew moved with military precision, each member taking their position as the Resolute slid into position, just outside the Zarks' fleet's range. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. They were about to engage the enemy on their terms, and there was no turning back. On the other side of the battlefield, the Zarks' fleet remained eerily still. The massive warships were dark, their sharp, angular designs cutting through the cold expanse of space like predatory sharks. Their sensors were locked onto the Resolute, their focus unwavering. But just as Jonathan had feared, something wasn't right. The Zarks were waiting, and they weren't acting in the aggressive way he had expected. "They're playing their game," Jonathan muttered under his breath. "But we won't play by their rules." As the tension built to a breaking point, a sudden jolt shook the Resolute. The Zarks had made their move. They launched a series of energy blasts, each one aimed directly at the ship's shield. The crew scrambled to respond, activating their own defense systems, but Jonathan knew the real fight wasn't with their weapons. It was with their minds. Now, Caldwell's voice came over the intercom, sharp and commanding. "Deploy the EMP. Hit them where it hurts." The signal was given, and the ship's massive EMP cannon flared to life. A pulse of electromagnetic energy rippled outward from the Resolute, blanketing the Zarks' fleet in a brilliant burst of light. The energy disrupted their advanced sensors, rendering them blind for several precious moments. Jonathan gritted his teeth. It was working, but this was only the beginning. The Zarks would quickly adapt. They always did. They had to keep the pressure on, disrupt their strategy further. But as the pulse faded, Jonathan felt a sinking feeling in his gut. The Zarks had already countered. A new signal blinked on the radar, one that he hadn't expected. It was faint, almost undetectable. A new threat had appeared, a desperate gamble. The Resolute lurched again, its entire frame groaning under the strain of the relentless assault. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. The ship's shields were almost gone, and the Zarks' fleet was closing in. Every move they made seemed to draw them deeper into a trap. The radar showed no sign of reinforcements. The battle was theirs to lose. "I need ideas, people," Jonathan barked. "The Zarks' tyrant is still in full force, and they're getting closer to locking us in. We need something more than just running and dodging." Lieutenant Vega, ever the strategist, stood up from his station. I've been thinking, sir. Our cloaking device can't hold them off for much longer. But if we use the asteroid field ahead as a shield and initiate a decoy maneuver, we might have a slim chance of breaking their formation. Jonathan's eyes flicked toward the screen, where the asteroid field loomed ominously in the distance. It was a treacherous labyrinth of floating debris, dangerous to navigate but offering an opportunity to hide. He clenched his jaw. The Zark's tyrant sensors were highly advanced, but could they be tricked? "We don't have time to think," Jonathan said, narrowing his eyes as his mind spun through the possibilities. "If we do this, we need to act fast." Vega's hands flew over the control panel. "If we drop out of warp, we'll lose precious time. The tyrant will detect us, but we can mask our heat signature by using the asteroid field to absorb our emissions. It won't be perfect, but it'll buy us enough time to regroup and formulate a counterattack. Then we'll do it," Jonathan said, making the decision. "Prepare the crew. We're about to take the gamble of our lives." The order was relayed to the crew, and the atmosphere aboard the Resolute grew heavy with tension. Everyone knew the risks. They could end up trapped in the asteroid field, with nowhere to run. But the alternative was certain destruction. The Zarks were methodical, patient, and merciless. They would track them down, corner them, and obliterate them without hesitation. The Resolute had no choice but to gamble everything. With a sudden jolt, the Resolute dropped out of warp, instantly entering the asteroid field. The crew was thrown against their harnesses as the ship veered sharply to avoid a massive floating rock. Jonathan gritted his teeth, forcing himself to focus as the asteroids raced by the windows in a blur of jagged edges and shadows. The ship's shields flared to life, but it was clear that they were weakening with every impact. The Zark's tyrant wasn't far behind. "Hold on," Jonathan muttered to himself, gripping the edge of his chair. The asteroid field was both a blessing and a curse. It could hide them, but it could also destroy them if they weren't careful. "Captain," Patil's voice came over the comms. "The tyrant's fleet is starting to split off, searching for us in smaller groups. They've realized we're using the field to our advantage. They'll adapt, sir." Jonathan's eyes narrowed as he stared at the screen. The enemy ships were already beginning to form new patterns. They were coordinating their search, scanning every corner of the asteroid field with precision. They weren't just chasing, they were hunting. "We need to buy more time," Jonathan said, thinking on his feet. "Activate the decoy drones. Release them on the outer edges of the field. We need to make them believe we're splitting up." The decoy drones were a last resort, small, unmanned devices that mimicked the ship's energy signature. They were designed to confuse enemy sensors, but they weren't foolproof. Still, it was their only option. The drones were deployed, disappearing into the shadows of the asteroid field. Jonathan held his breath. Would the Zarks fall for it? On the command deck, the tension was palpable. The seconds stretched on, each one feeling like a small eternity. Through the ship's reinforced windows, Jonathan could see the lights of distant stars flickering like tiny pinpricks in the vastness of space, but his focus remained solely on the radar screen. "We've lost contact with 2 of the drones," Paddle reported, her voice tight. "The Zarks are already figuring out the deception." Jonathan cursed, his mind racing. The Resolute was still being tracked, but as he looked around at his crew, his heart hardened. They were already in this too deep. They couldn't afford to stop now. They had to push forward. "Sir, there's a small cluster of asteroids ahead. Perfect for hiding our final maneuver," Vega said, pulling up a detailed map of the asteroid field. "If we angle the ship just right and use the remaining energy from our shields to mask the heat signature, we could disappear entirely for a few minutes." "That's our last chance," Jonathan said. His voice was low, almost a whisper, as if he was acknowledging the risk for the first time. "Do it." The ship veered sharply, engines roaring, as it slid into a narrow, twisting cluster of asteroids. The crew held their breath, eyes flicking from one readout to another. Every second counted. Every move could mean the difference between survival and annihilation. As the Resolute nestled into the center of the asteroid cluster, the radar fell eerily silent. Jonathan's fingers twitched nervously on the console. Were they still being tracked? The only sound was the steady hum of the ship's engines, the quiet thrum of the crew's anxious thoughts. And then came the call. "Captain," Vega shouted, his voice crackling with triumph. "The Tyrant is moving past us. We've lost them, at least for now." Jonathan let out a long, ragged breath. They were still alive. The gamble had worked. For now. But even as the crew celebrated their temporary victory, Jonathan knew better than to think the battle was over. The Zarks were relentless. They would regroup, refocus, and come after them again. The Resolute had dodged death this time, but how long could they keep running? "Status report," Jonathan said, his voice firm as he snapped out of the momentary relief. Patil quickly scanned the system. "We're down to 12% of our shields, Captain. The enemy fleet is reforming. They'll be back soon, and we're running low on supplies." Jonathan's mind raced. They had no more time to hide. They needed to act. "Now, we've got to take the fight to them," Jonathan said, standing up from his chair, determination settling in his bones. "Prepare the weapons. Get the crew ready. We're going on the offensive." Vega hesitated, his face grim as he processed the order. "Sir, with all due respect, we're too outgunned. The Zark's Tyrant's weapons." "We don't have a choice," Jonathan interrupted. "We've been playing defense long enough. If we keep running, we'll never get out of this alive. It's time to take control of the fight." He turned, facing the crew. "We're not going down as victims. We're going to make them regret ever challenging us. Get ready for a final stand." The crew exchanged glances, understanding the weight of Jonathan's words. They had survived against impossible odds before. Now they would make sure the Zarks knew exactly what humanity was capable of when pushed to the edge. The Resolute powered back up, its engines roaring as it emerged from the cover of the asteroid field. The Zark's fleet was already regrouping, circling around the Zark's Tyrant. But Jonathan had one final trick up his sleeve. He had analyzed their patterns, studied their tactics. The Resolute was ready. "We're going in," Jonathan said, his voice fierce with determination. "Full speed ahead." The ship rocketed toward the Zark's fleet, its weapons primed and ready. Jonathan didn't care if they were outnumbered. He didn't care if the odds were against them. This was their fight, one they would fight to the very end. And they were ready. The final stand. For a split second, there was nothing but the empty, suffocating silence of space. The Resolute was no longer visible to the Zark's fleet, cloaked under its experimental stealth technology. The intense beams of the Zark's Tyrant's assault had missed by mere inches. Inside the ship, the crew exhaled in unison, relief spreading like wildfire through the command center. But it wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jonathan's fingers gripped the edge of his command chair, his eyes scanning the various screens as if they would reveal some miracle. The cloaking device had worked, but only for a moment. The Zarks were too advanced, too relentless. He had seen their tactical brilliance firsthand, and now they were closing in on his position, like a predator who sensed the wounded prey struggling to escape. "Lieutenant Patil, where are they?" Jonathan asked, his voice steady despite the storm of anxiety surging through him. Patil's fingers were moving rapidly, searching for any sign of their pursuers. "The Zarks are scanning. It won't take long before they—" Suddenly, a shrill alarm cut her off. Red lights began to flash across the command deck. "Their sensors have adjusted," Patil confirmed, her voice tinged with panic. "They've found our location." Jonathan cursed under his breath. Their brief respite had ended. The Zarks were closing in, and they had only minutes before the fleet would bring them into the heart of their attack range. His mind raced. There had to be another way, a strategy that would give them a fighting chance. But with the Zark's Tyrant bearing down on them, he knew their time was running out. There was no more room for mistakes. "Commander," Vega called from her station, his voice carrying a sense of urgency. "I've been tracking the enemy fleet's movements. They're anticipating our next move. If we keep running, they'll trap us in their fire zone." Jonathan gritted his teeth. "So, what do you suggest? We just sit here and wait for them to destroy us?" Vega hesitated, but then something flashed in his eyes. An idea, a plan. "No, sir. We need to take the fight to them." Jonathan's heart skipped a beat. "What are you suggesting?" Vega's hands danced over the console, pulling up a holographic map of the battlefield. "If we make a direct assault on the Zark's tyrant, not from the front, but from below, we can catch them by surprise. They won't expect us to engage them head-on with our shields still intact. We could create a window to breach their defense and get close enough to take down their flagship." Jonathan's gaze hardened, and he considered Vega's words. It was risky, dangerous even. The Zarks were a cunning and formidable enemy, but if they waited any longer, they'd be picked off one by one. The time for hesitation was over. "Do it," Jonathan said, his voice unwavering. The Resolute shifted its course, breaking away from the cluster of enemy ships and plunging deeper into the fray. The entire crew held their breath, eyes wide with anticipation. They had no margin for error. If they miscalculated, if they were even a second too slow, the Zark's tyrant would reduce them to space dust. Jonathan's hands gripped the edge of his chair once more as the ship's engines roared to life, pushing the vessel at full speed toward the Zark's tyrant. He could feel the energy coursing through the ship. This was it. There was no turning back. The Zark's tyrant loomed ahead, its massive form darkening the stars around it. The flagship's weapon systems were already locking onto the Resolute, its plasma cannons charging in preparation for the final blow. Jonathan's mind raced as they closed the gap, the seconds stretching into what felt like hours. "Prepare for impact," Vega called, his voice calm but filled with urgency. "Shields at full power. Brace yourselves." The crew braced for the inevitable assault. Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest. The enemy was too strong, their weapons too advanced. But they had one thing the Zarks didn't, a relentless will to survive. "Now," Jonathan shouted, "activate the decoy drone. Release it just ahead of us." A small drone, no larger than a fighter ship, detached from the Resolute's underside. The drone surged ahead, replicating the ship's signature energy readings. It was a brilliant move, one that would confuse the Zark's sensors for just enough time to misdirect their fire. For a moment, the flagship's weapons veered off course, targeting the drone as the Resolute continued its plunge toward them. Jonathan's hands tightened on the control panel. They were moments away from entering the heart of the enemy fleet. "Fire everything we've got," Jonathan ordered, his voice sharp. "All weapons systems, target the Zark's tyrant's forward shields." "Firing," Patel called out. The ship's cannons roared, sending a barrage of plasma and energy beams directly at the Zark's tyrant. The explosions lit up the void, creating a massive display of firepower. But it wasn't enough. The Zark's tyrant's shields absorbed most of the impact, rippling under the stress but holding strong. Jonathan cursed again. Their weapons weren't powerful enough to break the flagship's defenses. But as they neared the tyrant, something else occurred to him. "Vega, I need you to prep the secondary charge. Now," Jonathan barked. Vega's eyes widened. "Are you sure?" "That's a one-time use, sir. If we do this—" "I'm sure," Jonathan interrupted. "Do it. We have no other choice." Vega didn't hesitate. He hit the command, and from the depths of the ship's hull, a massive energy charge began to warm. It was a risky maneuver, one that used a high-energy explosive designed to breach even the most impenetrable shields. With every second, the Zark's tyrant grew closer. Their weapons fired again, this time grazing the Resolute's shields, sending jolts of electricity through the hull. Jonathan felt the ship lurch beneath his feet, but they were so close now, just a few moments away from the heart of their final assault. "Charge complete," Vega shouted. Prepare for detonation. The moment arrived. Jonathan's mind seemed to slow, the seconds stretching into eternity. The Resolute was now within range, just within reach of the Zark's tyrant's core. The secondary charge was ready, and all that was left was to trigger it. He spoke one last time, his voice low but resolute. Do it. A massive explosion rocked the battlefield. The shockwave from the detonation spread like wildfire, rippling through the space between the two fleets. For a moment, the universe itself seemed to hold its breath. The Zark's tyrant's shield shattered, its hull breaking apart as the devastating charge reached its core. The flagship's engine sputtered, its form buckling under the immense pressure. The enemy fleet, now disoriented, struggled to maintain control. Without their leader, the Zark ships faltered, their once impenetrable formation collapsing into chaos. Jonathan stared at the destruction unfolding before him, his breath shallow. The Zark's tyrant, the symbol of their enemy's dominance, was now a floating ruin. But the battle wasn't over. The remaining Zark ships turned toward the Resolute, now vulnerable without the tyrant to lead them. We need to finish this, Jonathan muttered, his eyes steely with resolve. He stood, gripping the armrest. Full speed ahead. This ends now.